Hello and welcome to another episode of the Revenue Revolution podcast, sponsored by Joint Flows. Today we're joined by Doron Luder, experienced VP of Sales and all-around commercial leader. How are you today?
Doing well, Hitesh. How are you?
Very good. Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. We always like to start with a little bit of an introduction so our listeners can get a bit of a flavor in terms of who you are. So tell us who you are.
Sure. So I've been working in sales for about 16 years now. I built and hired and onboarded sales teams in the last 3-4 companies I've worked in. I've also been a mentor and advisor on a couple of accelerators, so Techstars, Mass Challenge, and a judge as well. And I've also been an advisor for a number of startups as well. One that was acquired by Cisco a couple of months ago. Yeah.
Wow. Awesome. A great background. For those of you who don't know, Doron has been part of multiple acquisitions as well. So I'd like to touch on that as well. Actually, it's a good starting place, really. Is there a common trait that you see within companies when you join to say, actually, yeah, this one looks like it's going to take off, or this looks like they've got a good exit strategy in place, and so this is where I want to focus my effort?
Yeah, definitely. So it's interesting. It's actually a non-sales characteristic, but it definitely starts with the culture, which has to be built by design from the outset by the founders.
Mm-hmm.
So 3 elements: culture built by design from the outset by the founders, and that's something you need to invest in really early on, because there's a culture debt that builds up after time. You hire people, everyone is going to take the culture in a different direction. So you really need to set that culture early on. And it has to be a high performing culture, basically a transparent culture. And it's something that the sales team obviously need to buy into, in addition to, your marketing team, your product team, your ops team, all the teams, but they all need to be aligned to that, high performing culture.
Yeah, awesome. And have you seen any kind of mechanisms that leaders put in place to achieve that culture? Because it's very much as like someone like Mick and I, who have obviously founded a company and, we're in a specific growth trajectory. It's something that we talk about and think about for the future as well. How are we going to get the right culture in place? Like, what kind of advice can you give in terms of putting together the correct framework for that?
Yeah, so it's again also a great question. I think there are 2 things. One is like the behaviors that you encourage, and the second is the rituals that you put in place. So in terms of the behaviors you encourage, this is something that you can do as a founder and as a like a leader within like a startup organization. And that's kind of leading by example, leading from the front, with specifically like surfacing those types of behaviors that you want to build within that culture. So learning agility, you start by documenting your own learning, right? Making yourself, building transparency. You have to think about the behaviors that you want and then communicate those in a way which gives examples that you're doing, so that people start to emulate you. So that's the behavior piece. And then in terms of the rituals, there are rituals out there which are so brilliant and they just feel so stupid when you do them, right? But they're the ones that really are impactful, and that when people start to normalize, like they feel a sense of identity, they feel engaged. I remember when I was working in Rackspace, they had this straight jacket, like something you would put like someone who was a bit out there, you needed to kind of control, with your hands behind your back in this straitjacket, and they would give it to the person it was called the fanatical support jacket. So the person who had the most fanatical support for customers, who had gone above and beyond, who had done something really amazing for customers, you put them in the straitjacket every single month, a different person, and they also got like a reward. I can't remember, like an Amazon voucher or something as well, just to, and you're creating the rituals there that really, surface the type of behavior, again, that you want to encourage. So those are the 2 things I would say that really help to put in place a culture which is going to bring in the right people, and it's going to transform the people you got into the right people as well.
Yeah,
Amazing.
It's very interesting because I've seen a few companies where they've got these values, these are our 6 core values, and it's integrity and all the keywords that they're really good on paper when you're trying to hire. So oh, diversity, oh, that's great. Oh, and yeah, we'll protect you. And then eventually it feels like the culture is kind of degrading, you know, is getting a little bit damaged. How do you protect that culture as you grow? Because as you said, like people will take your culture into different directions. How do you make sure you kind of fence it?
So you're talking about, obviously you need to come in with your values, right? Every single startup, you know, needs to come with social values. And the question is, like, how do you stop it just becoming like a checkbox? And you have to align those values back to those behaviors that you want to see, and then give a sales floor, or ground floor ways in which people can start to build those values from your behaviors. So you have to think really, really carefully what your values are. If you want them just to be part of the culture, that's okay as well. You can have transparency, you can have, teamwork and stuff. But if you really want to build them into like behaviors that people are actually like emulating, then you really need to think, what are the behaviors I want and what are the values behind those, and then work backwards from there.
Yeah, I see it. I mean, it happened a lot lately with layoffs. You know, you've got all these values and we're family and we're all of that. And then all of a sudden you're like, well, actually, guys, we're going to have to let you go. And that's very damaging, because you're like, oh, well, I thought you had my back, like, so when the going gets tough, like what happens? So how do you manage that as a leader? Because you've probably been exposed to these kind of things as well throughout the years.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we all have, everyone's reporting to someone else, right? So you're an individual contributor. If you're an individual contributor, you can be reporting to a team leader. If you're a team leader, you can be reporting to like a department head, and department heads are reporting to someone else, and ultimately C-level also reporting to their investors as well. So I mean, that is the structure in which we operate in tech startups, basically. And the reality is that I'm not sure if there is a way to rebuild that structure, because it is a system that works. It's not a perfect system, it's an imperfect system. And there's obviously like a type of a relationship that you need to strike a balance between the employer and the employee, and try and get that right. And sometimes there are market headwinds that kind of take that off course, and you just have to rebalance that and make sure you're getting it right. But it's a hard one to get. I don't know if I have an answer to that, because it's about how do you design the system to work for all parties involved. So it's definitely a balancing act there.
Yeah, and while we're speaking about culture, as someone who's built out several sales teams, what kind of advice do you give to people who are building out their first sales team? Or at the moment, we're seeing a lot of restructuring taking place as well, right? Because, unfortunately, a lot of companies are not attaining the targets that they thought they would be. And as part of that, there's a lot of reshuffling happening and taking place. So what kind of characteristics do you look like in an individual first at an IC level when you're bringing them into the team? But then when you think about what you want the team to look like overall, what's important with the bigger picture as well?
Sure. So when you're hiring for your first like man on the ground, it's different to when you're hiring to build out your team, right? But there are kind of two parts to that interview process. The first is the hard skills. So you want to make sure that if you're hiring for someone that you want to know they can do the job, you're hiring for someone that is able to demonstrate, closing ability, is able to demonstrate, discovery beyond the surface. And there's ways in which you can test that with like scenarios and giving them a task, for example. If you're hiring for someone who's new, you're probably going to focus on the second set of values more, which is their soft skills, right? And the most important thing, I think, when it comes to soft skills, especially in a startup, is coachability, right? You might have someone who's got 10 years experience, 15 years experience. That's going to be a debt to them if they can't learn something new. that's not going to be a benefit. It's not going to be an asset. It's going to actually hold them back. Whereas a new person that comes in that doesn't know anything, but is tremendously hungry to learn, they have a coachability there, which is really powerful. And sometimes it's more important than the hard skills when you're working in a startup environment.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, in a startup, the coachability aspect is so important, especially because you often find you're being reactive. You don't have as many processes in place as you potentially would have at a bigger company. And so that ability to react, learn, and adapt is so important. But what I find tricky is being able to differentiate between somebody who puts up a good show in an interview process and comes across as someone who's going to be a good learner and someone who's going to be agile and adaptable. But then when they actually, you know, when the tires hit the road and they're actually in the role, are very stubborn, not willing to change. How are you able to differentiate between the two as part of that process?
Why are you looking at me when you're saying this first?
I mean, I was looking at you, but I was actually looking at the screen, but it was specifically looking at you because Mick was very hard to work with.
Listen, I think that feedback is tough for anyone, and it's kind of like a muscle, right? You kind of want to get it. Firstly, when you're giving feedback, you want to give feedback in doses, right? You don't want to give it full on. You know, you take. It's a medicine, right? Which means that you need to take it in measured amounts. Everyone needs to, and everyone should be given it in measured amounts. And that's the first thing. The second thing is that feedback should always be a dialogue as well. So it should always work both ways. It should start with a positive thing. It should end on a positive thing. And it should be a question of both people reciprocating feedback, right? If you're looking for one person to do something different, which is totally fine, that happens the whole time, you need to trade a behavior yourself. You need to say, I'm going to change this together with that change as well. So that's another like way of doing it, and to make sure that it becomes like a reciprocating type of experience rather than like a one-way road.
Do you feel like leaders know how to do this when they first become leaders? Like I always take the same example as where someone is promoted from being an individual contributor to managing their team members. And first time manager, they may never have learned how to teach to people to start with. So how do you do this in a very high pressured environment with targets and people you would be in competition with for the same role? Like, how do you teach that, Doron?
Yeah, so it's funny, you know, that you start as an account executive and you think, wow, these are really tough skills. I need to learn these hard skills, and you spend your whole day working on them, working on your messaging, your pitch, your close, and you get to a point you're like, I can do this, I mastered this. You get the confidence to move forward, and then you just assume that it's going to be as like a team leader or someone that's building out sales, or you're going to be doing more of what you were doing already. When actually it's completely the opposite. You're going to be doing less of what you were doing now. And actually the question is, what's going to become to the forefront is, how do you take those hard skills and build them into other people? And that means learning a whole new set of social, emotional skills and behavioral skills as well. So, and it's starting from when you start as a frontline manager in your first role, you're starting that journey again, like when you started in sales, because you are now selling into your team, but you can't do hard closes with them, right? You can't sell them value because you have to start with their personal outcomes. So it's a much more nuanced and sophisticated, you know, like process that you're going through as a frontline manager, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And what do you think makes for a good manager? And I think, I mean, there are questions twofold, because I know you've worked at different sizes of companies throughout your career as well. So what do you think makes for a good team leader when you are going from first man on the ground to leading the sales team, which is often the route that takes place, versus when you're in a more established company and you're taking on a team? What do you think makes a good leader, and what characteristics are important in both of those scenarios?
you know, what you need to do and what you need to demonstrate change as the companies change, as the scales changes. What you need to always be doing is you always need to be operating on all levels of the company. And when you're in a bigger company, there are more levels, right? So you're not just closing deals with your, you know, as like a, you know, you're not just kind of like jumping onto calls and tagging along and helping them close the deal, being, you know, facilitating closes, for example. You're doing a lot more mentoring, you're doing a lot more building, a lot more coaching, a lot more communicating as the company scales. You're less hands-on, but you always need to be able, that's what you're doing. So your doing becomes much more, I guess, stratified. There's more layers as you grow, as the company grows. But you always need to be able to demonstrate to the people below you that you can lead from the front. And that is irrelevant. A team might be one person, a startup. You might be in charge of 1,000 people, 10,000 people, but you always need to be able to demonstrate that you can be leading from the front to your team members, because that's how you build their trust and take them on your journey.
Yeah.
And when you say leading, sorry, I was gonna say, when you say leading from the front, do you mean being in the trenches alongside them, or?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I remember when I was working in a company with 6,000 people, and CEO from America comes over, and there's about 1,000 people on our UK, in the UK side, about 400 on the sales floor. And the CEO comes into the building, and big building, and he literally says his intros, he gets a coffee, and then the next thing he does is he literally goes round to every individual and just comes up to them and just introduces, hey, I'm not going to say his name, I'm not going to get into it into detail, but hey, my name's David, nice to meet you. And everyone's like literally, he came up to, hey, David, there is great to meet you. And the next one, and then the guy next to me goes, isn't that the CEO? He probably has. So, you know, he really got in there and spent probably about 2 hours just introducing himself to every single person in the UK operation. And that's it took him like a couple of hours of his time. But I mean, that happened to me more than a decade ago, and I still vividly remember that experience of him coming up to me and me looking at him in the eye and being like, I was just really like, it just made an impression.
Yeah, a little goes a long way.
It's because the opposite is true as well, and it doesn't have to be with a CEO. But I was speaking about this literally last week with one of my friends, and he said, "Oh, we've got a new VP of sales. The person has been in the role for like 4 weeks now, a month. Haven't had a one-to-one yet. Haven't had a proper conversation. Doesn't know what I'm doing. Can't even call me by my name." And like, people remember that little gesture of just opening the dialogue, just breaking the barrier, so that you can set the right example from the start. I've got a question for you, Doron, around when you create a culture. There's a lot of it around how do you connect on that personal level, and often is, you know, going for a drink and doing things that are a little bit more out of work, as opposed to like dealing with like deals and things like that. But there's also a culture of don't party with your team members, like that create separation purposefully and maintain it so that you never cross the line. What's your opinion on this?
So there's two things here. The first is that your team leaders always need to feel reassured that you have their back, and they need to know that, and you need to remind them of that, because there's going to be ups and downs to their week, just like there's ups and downs to your week, and you need to make sure that they remember that every single week. But then the second thing is that, you know, when you come in as a frontline manager, you know, one of the things that you learn is that you don't need to be liked, but you do need to be respected. And that doesn't mean that you don't want people to like you, because if they know that you have their back, they will respect you, but not just from like a, you know, general up in the office type thing, they'll respect you and follow you as well. So there's a balance here, because you want to build like a soft respect in there, because they know that you are engaged in their, personal outcomes as well. But it's different to being liked as well, which is I would say it's just not it's not where you should be focusing your time. It's a slightly different emotion. You're trying to build a different type of relationship that you want to build between yourself and your individual contributors.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a fine line, isn't it? It's like, Skip Miller speaks about stepping into the bus. Like, don't step into the bus. Don't sit in the bus with your team members, because it's really hard to have a hard conversation when you've been partying with someone. But it's also very tempting. It's just as a human, just to be like, yeah, I'm creating those connections, I'm working with these people, I want to kind of blow off some steam as well.
Yeah. In case you didn't know, Mick likes to party.
I love to party.
That's the moral of the question.
It's cool. Yeah, it is a fine line, and because you're being asked as a manager, you're being asked to do two things that really are like in conflict.
Yeah.
You're being asked to be emotionally engaged with your team, but also emotionally detached as well when necessary. So you're taking these two skills and you're trying to get the right one in the right situation. So you really need to be in control of that, of those two different skills. And they're skills, right? You shouldn't be emotionally engaged just because you love doing X or Y with a certain person. And you shouldn't be emotionally detached because you're burnt out and you can't be bothered. You need to really be in control of those two skills and use them to manage effectively, because it's for the benefit of the employees as well. They need that type of leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. And so once you've built out that team, now you've got a structure in place, then obviously your team start working deals. If we start talking about what's happening out there with regards to actual deals at the moment as well, a lot of people are facing challenges, the normal challenges. I won't ask you to go through them, but it's, lengthened sales cycles, more stakeholders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What strategies can you recommend that help to solve these issues and maybe help to ensure sales processes don't get prolonged?
So, I mean, there's a ton of strategies. But if you're asking about a sales rep, what can a sales rep do? The first thing they should do is they should definitely double down on the playbook. If they don't have a playbook, they must get a playbook, because if you don't have a system, you don't even know where the gaps are. So you need to start with a process and a playbook. And that's how you can build a scalable sales, value proposition and close deals. So doubling down on the playbook is I'd say number one. I actually think that the second thing that salespeople can do is they can start to be more creative with some of the ways in which they sell. So they need to kind of think of, how do they build a niche for their selling process? How do they create a more specific way in which they sell, which is much more aligned with their prospects? And that's something which is much more specific to the company. And you need to go much, much deeper there and do much more solid training to make that work. But I have seen that work with some sales teams where they're building a much more niche style approach to the sales process, and they're adding in more, I'd say, sophisticated selling techniques. Again, it depends. Some people, an inexperienced sales rep might not be ready for that. But if they are coachable, there are some selling techniques you can add in which can increase their close ratio, or can increase deal size, or shorten sales cycles. So that's one thing I've seen which has worked. But then there's a lot of things outside of the sales team as well, which also have an impact. Product, marketing as well, which can also, you can improve on.
Can you give me an example of, so firstly, love your answer, especially about the playbooks. You're talking joint flows language there, which is always great, especially because we didn't tell you to say that. So that's great. But in terms of the second part where you said selling in a niche, can you talk a little bit more about this?
Yeah. So a lot of the time when we sell, we focus on value propositions and elevator pitches, and that's fine. And that's important, by the way. But the thing is that, you give someone a business case, no one's actually going to buy because of the business case. They're going to rationalize their decision because of the business case you gave them, right? That's not how they decide to make a decision. No one looks at a business case today and says, wow, didn't realize return on investment, or didn't realize, the cost of inaction, or whatever it is. No one says, oh, now I know it. Now I'm convinced. People rationalize their decisions based upon business metrics, which is important. But how are those decisions actually made? And a lot of that starts with personal outcomes and personal trust and engagement. So there's a lot of ways in which you can build engagement and trust, which is not part of the sales playbook. And we're not teaching it to sales reps, but it really does impact, it compounds as you start to build a sales process and you engage with someone on a journey that they're looking at it as a window shopping journey, and you give them what they need as a window shopper, and it transforms slowly but surely into a buying journey for them as well.
This is very interesting because it links to the point of kind of elevating the conversation. Okay, this is what the solution does, but we're fixing like strategic problems here. And I joined the company in the past, and we were selling to like executive teams, like having an impact on bottom line. Very important metrics. And the team I was managing had no understanding whatsoever of like business mechanics. How do you recognize revenue? Like, what's the impact of delay? What's the slippage? Like all of these things. But you were asking them to kind of present and defend a business case in front of potentially a CEO or a CRO, or someone who's got a lot of background on managing those kind of complex metrics. So how do you diagnose that, Doron, when you take on a team, and how do you say, okay, well, there's presenting the business case, but they're also understanding it and being able to then defend it?
I mean, I think that's a part of understanding your target ICP and the buying personas involved in the sales process, because you need to get deep into the shoes of your buying persona. Like, what it is that they do, what does their world look like? Like, what are the top 50 terms in their dictionary, the values that they hold by, their metrics, their targets, their goals? You need to establish professional authority with them at the beginning of the sales process, or whenever you meet them, to show that you absolutely understand where they're coming from, and they are not going to need to spend time educating you, that you're there to educate them, basically. And you can educate them with insight once you establish authority with them, and they realize that this guy gets it. He gets it. He understands my world. He probably has something I could learn. I'm willing to listen.
Yeah, and before the call, we spoke about deal getting lost between stages, which I think is very important, because like the way we see it is your funnel is your funnel, and you may have like 5 or 6 stages, but really you've got a very complex buying process, and that doesn't really fit well into a 5-stage funnel. And you spoke about being able to kind of create documentation that then support the evolution of the deal. Like, can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because obviously from the buying process, right, we talk about the buying experience, but the reality is that sales reps are not targeted on like a buying experience, and they're not targeted on creating personal outcomes, and they're targeted on revenue, and there's a reason for that, but that is a sales process. So there's definitely a friction between what the buyer needs and what the sales guy wants to sell, right? Usually a buyer is, when they're coming to see something, the simplest and easiest thing for them to buy is a tool, right? They only want to buy a tool, right? It's easy for them. It's a tool, it's simple, it's a hack, it's something that increases that, something really, really simple, really it increases productivity or reduces cost. They want it as simple as possible. But the sales rep is not willing to, he doesn't want to sell a tool. He wants to sell a transformation, because a tool is something you can buy online, right? You don't need a sales guy for that. You could just go online and just buy it with like your credit card for, $1,000 a year, whatever it is. But a sales rep, when you put a sales rep into a sales process, there's a reason for that. And because they're trying to take this value proposition and turn it from what a buyer wants, which is a tool, to what a sales rep wants to sell, which is a transformation, a business transformation, a team transformation or something, a team, an output which has an organizational impact, right?
Yeah.
So the challenge is that buyers want one thing, sales reps want something else. And therefore, there's a lot of times when the sales guy is following the playbook. And he says, right, you're at stage 3 now. How do I get you to stage 4? But actually, there's so many steps that the buyer needs to get to buy in to what stage 4 looks like. And that's where there's a lot of tools where you can use them to really, really get the buy-in from this from in the buying experience, which is separate to that sales process.
It's amazing. I know a tool that helps address just that. As I won't say what they're called, but but yeah, amazing. Once again, that was not we didn't tell Doron to say that, so there you go. Awesome. Well, look, Doron, I've really enjoyed having you on the podcast. Unfortunately, we are just about out of time, but we do have a wrap-up question which we ask all of our listeners, and the question is, for your whole career to date, and by the looks of it, you've had an amazing career to date, so this might be difficult to answer. But what has been your favorite memory so far, and why?
Definitely the memories that stick out the most are the role models and leaders and mentors that I've learned from in my career. And those are the people that years later you still remember and you're still learning lessons from, as a kind of like seed that they planted many years ago. And you're finding yourself in new scenarios, thinking back to those memories that you had with those sales leaders and mentors, and thinking, how would they have answered this question? Or I had a scenario like this when I was a sales rep with this person, and this is how they dealt with it. And those are definitely the things that stick with me and have, benefited most in my career.
Amazing. Great answer. I used to report into Mick once upon a time, and so I'll take all of that learning with me as well. Awesome. Doron, thank you so much for being a guest on our podcast. It's been really informative, and I've really enjoyed myself, and I'm sure our listeners will too. Thank you very much. This has been the Revenue Revolution podcast, sponsored by Joyned. Until next time, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.